Welcome in, everybody, for another edition of Head to Head, talking Alabama football as just 3 weeks remain in the college football regular season. Hard to believe, Mike. It has absolutely flown by, but Alabama, a lot to be excited about after a dominant statement win at LSU. Now the Tide preparing for an off week in terms of SEC play as they welcome in Mercer on Saturday. We will talk everything the win over the Tigers and look ahead to the final few weeks. Let's go head to head. Well, Mike, I think I already told you this, but you were pretty much spot on when we previewed this LSU game. You said that Alabama would roll through Jalen Milroe. I think that several folks have seen that. We've all seen that really throughout the entire season. When he's good, Alabama's good. When he's not, Alabama struggles. Jalen Milroe was definitely good in Baton Rouge last weekend.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And you and I talked about a little bit about Brian Kelly's presser from a week ago, and I was honestly caught off guard a little bit when he talked about Jalen Milroe. And he said last year, coming into this game, a game where Jalen Milroe had around 160 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns against Jaden Daniels and company last year. And Brian Kelly just said, hey, we weren't really sure what he was a year ago under Tommy Rees, and they were using him in different ways. And he got benched and he came back and he said, this year we have a better idea of what he is. And it was interesting because you fast forward throughout the week, and you and I talking, and you go back and you watch Jalen Milroe play LSU once again. And with everything that's changed around Jalen Milroe and around LSU and around Alabama, different head coaches, different staff, it was the same game. It was interesting to watch it play out. I mean, LSU, obviously a different defensive coordinator. They fired who was there last year. They go to Missouri. They hired the highest paid assistant coach in the country at defensive coordinator and pay him $2.5 million a year. And you could see at the end of the game that Brian Kelly not happy with the outcome of that one. So Jalen Milroe and company getting it done on the ground, doing some things differently. And, Simone looked like his legs felt pretty fresh coming off the bye week. So it was nice to see.
Yeah, no doubt about that. 4 touchdowns on the ground. I think nearly 300 total yards for Jalen Milroe. He was the co-offensive SEC player of the week. Jahad Campbell was the co-defensive player of the week. Mike, what did you see from this Alabama defense? I feel like they were playing pretty inspired football. This was a game that Alabama jumped out quick, and they were not going to back down throughout 4 quarters. And you saw in the post-game stuff that there were some people over on the LSU side and not happy that Alabama was sending about 10 dudes there with late in the game. What did you see from just all of that and the drama that unfolded late there?
It was shades of what we saw against Missouri, where they were trying to, Kane Womack was trying to preserve the shutout against Missouri. They were trying to keep LSU out of the end zone at the end of this one. And to be honest, it played out exactly like I thought it would, although I was probably not giving Alabama's secondary enough credit for their ability to cover LSU's wide receiver core. Now, you and I talked about last week how LSU would be minus their left guard in this game, a guy who had started, 30-some-odd games for them and would be having to go to the backup and might struggle in the interior of the offensive line. But you thought maybe with the bye week and everything that comes into that, maybe they would be still pretty strong up front. But right off the top, you saw Kane Womack run a twist game on the left side of LSU's offensive line, try to get in the face of Garrett Nussmeier, running zero blitzes, Fonzie blitzes, A-gap, B-gap, stunts. I mean, they were all over the place and really doing a nice job of testing, LSU's offensive front and the communication that comes along with having a new starter. And so I thought that LSU's defensive front really passed the test. I mean, they're not just blitzing from the linebacker level. They're blitzing safeties. They're blitzing corners. They tried to wreak havoc. And really what I thought, and you and I talked about this a little bit, this is a different offense than Alabama's faced all year. This is not, the running style quarterback. This is not Diego Pavia or some of the other pieces that you've seen along the way. And Garrett Nussmeier, not really mobile, doesn't really utilize his legs. I think he only had like 2 or 3 positive carries on the year. When you add that in, Alabama's defense smelled blood in the water and really did a nice job of attacking that pocket and forcing Garrett Nussmeier into some bad decisions.
When you think about what this game does for Alabama as they move forward now, 3 weeks remaining in the regular season. Next up is Mercer. As of this recording, we don't know what the college football playoff rankings are, but given that Alabama was in a week ago, one can just assume that they will still be in. Obviously, the Tide's still very much in the mix. But when you start to do the math and you see what the SEC rankings look like. Several big games going into this weekend that will have implications throughout the rest of the season, really. Where do you think this Tide team really matches up when you think about the national landscape and the SEC championship game and what it looks like for this 12-team playoff? I know it's a loaded question. I'm not really asking you to necessarily say exactly what you think, but for a win like this specifically, what can this do for this team as you enter these last few weeks?
Well, Simone, with a question that loaded, the best option is just to be honest. No, I think Bama's still improving. Do I think Bama is the best team in the country? No. Do I think they're capable of being? Yes. I think personnel-wise and understanding of the scheme, they are definitely capable of being the best team in the country. And that's what's so interesting about this football season. A lot of people thought Georgia was the best team in the country. Honestly, at 2 different points this year, we've probably thought Georgia was the best team in the country. And yet they get dismantled by Ole Miss over the weekend. And, obviously Alabama fans know that feeling in the middle of a dynasty that, some Georgia fans feel that they are in the midst of right now. You go to Ole Miss and you get hit in the chin and it doesn't end well. And so, look, you can point to Texas. Texas is your leader right now in the SEC, but when you look at their schedule, they haven't really played anybody. The only good team they've played is Georgia, and they got whooped by the Georgia Bulldogs. So you can really go up and down the slate of SEC teams. And the irony of it is that all the teams that you've beat, or honestly, the teams that you haven't beat, Vanderbilt and Tennessee, as a Bama fan, you now need to root for those teams because the tiebreaker at the end of the season will be about your conference opponent's record. And that's really what's propping Alabama up right now is conference opponent's record. You thought that maybe it would be a black eye that you lost to Vanderbilt. Well, Vanderbilt's record's propping you up right now. Tennessee's record is propping you up. South Carolina getting it done over the weekend is propping you up. So, look, I don't pretend to know what you're going to get. You and I both know that this season has been a roller coaster ride at times for Alabama, and you're going to get Oklahoma's best shot and obviously Auburn's best shot at the end of the year. So Bama just needs to do, like we talked about last week, they need to go in and deal with business and make sure that they are focused on all the right things. We saw in the Iron Bowl last year, if you're not completely focused on what you need to do, Auburn can always sneak up and get you. And hopefully, no matter what happens this week against Mercer, that you can kind of keep that trend alive and deal with business against Oklahoma and Auburn. But there is a lot of evenly matched teams in the SEC and really in the country when you look at those Big Ten teams. And I think at this point, Alabama fans just want, Bama to focus on themselves and hopefully find themselves in a playoff scenario. And even if you don't, maybe you luck around and get a home game there in Tuscaloosa, which would be fun as well.
Yeah, it really is. There are a ton of games this week for Alabama. One of those games that's more of an opportunity. I mean, no diss on Mercer either. This is a 9-1 team. Right. I think that you always kind of look forward to, I guess, having this little bit of an off week in SEC play. Usually it was right before the Iron Bowl, just historically. But you always didn't want to have a hiccup either, and I think that was always something that Nick Saban kind of hounded on when they had teams like Mercer or, ULM or whoever it was coming in late. It was like, hey, we need to dial in. Here's where we can improve. How do you envision maybe the mindset is for this team going into it? I know that Coach Kalen DeBoer said earlier this week in his Monday press conference that he wants to see his guys continue to get better, that there's don't rest on your laurels, know that this is a huge win, but how do we handle success? And I think that this is certainly going to be one of those answers that we find out pretty quickly up against Mercer.
Yeah, there's no doubt. It's a balancing act. I know you've been around it a number of times. It's a balancing act, I think, as a head coach, because you're like, want them to take them seriously, but as soon as we get a big enough lead, they're all going to come out because, we won't want anybody to get hurt. I remember very vividly, we played Tennessee Chattanooga, I believe it was, in the second to last game, the week before the Iron Bowl, in 2009, and Mark Ingram's in the middle of a Heisman campaign, right? And it was all about 100-yard games and how many rushing yards he could have. I think Mark Ingram was like 10 carries for 102 yards, and the minute he got 100 yards, Nick was like, "All right, get out." It was like, that's fine, that's fine. Yep. Look, and it's no disrespect. Like, to your point, it's no disrespect about Mercer. Mercer's a very good football team, by the way. Anybody that hasn't paid attention, I think they're 9-1 on the season, if I'm not mistaken. So they're a good team. The style they play kind of similar to, what you saw out of Wisconsin earlier in the year, spread, but like to run the ball. And they got a true freshman quarterback that's pretty good. So they'll come in and give you their best shot. But it really, when, you focus on Alabama and what they need to get done, I think Bama has to continue to build their identity in this game. And, it's easy to say that, but you say it's against Mercer, and what kind of an identity can you establish against Mercer? We thought the same thing a little bit, coming off Western Kentucky, and then you play South Florida, and it's like, what are we? South Florida, that game was a 5-point game at the end of the game. So I just think you have to continue to build on that, really iron out some of the kinks, as well as I think Alabama's offensive line played this past weekend, Simone. There were still times Jaden Robert leaves the games at right guard. You have a couple of different rotational players at right guard. LSU started running run stunts up front, and the communication offensive line wasn't really there. They didn't pass it off very well, and it ended in some, tackles for loss against the running backs from Alabama. So those are just simple things. Passing off twist games, understanding schematically what you're looking for, hitting your check downs from the quarterback position and being crisp running your routes, and also blocking back in the secondary with the wide receivers. So there's a number of different things you can work on. But, truth be told, I think when you ask Kalen DeBoer after the game, it's going to be about the health report card, if you will. And it's going to be about who came out clean and who didn't. And obviously that'll be the biggest takeaway, I think, from this game on Saturday.
Yeah, I don't necessarily need you to put a number on this, though. If you want to, in terms of prediction, that's fine. Obviously, I think that we all feel pretty confident. Every time I say this, I always regret it halfway through the game, and it's like, oh gosh, something feels close, it's more uncomfortable than you want it to be. But when you think about predictions, where do you think that this game will be? And then bigger than that, Mike, as Alabama looks to the back half, not the back half, but the last two games this year, you go to Oklahoma, and then of course the Iron Bowl. How can a game like this just kind of set you up for success in those final 2 weeks that are going to be pivotal in terms of where Alabama stands as they look to make this playoff run, or to be in the playoff in any capacity at this point as a 2-loss SEC team?
Yeah, and I think, looking ahead to Oklahoma, and I'll start with Mercer. I don't want to disrespect Mercer because Mercer's good. Like I said, this is a Mercer team whose only loss, I believe, is to Samford this year. Gave up 50-plus to Samford. Mercer actually played Ole Miss a year ago. Now, they didn't have the same quarterback, same head coach, but they played Ole Miss a year ago, and I think Ole Miss won, by, I don't want to say, this is going to sound disrespectful, I think by 70 points. So, it is what it is. And I think if you do things the right way, that this should prove to be a game where you can build some of that depth that you're going to need, in a stretch run. This is a longer schedule. If you do make the playoffs, it's a longer schedule than you've ever had. It's the longest schedule in the history of college football. And so building depth, as we've seen, with Q Robinson going down this past weekend, it's going to be a big deal. So I do, however, look at Oklahoma, and I do feel much more comfortable about that game probably than I should, simply from the fact that Alabama went into one of the most hostile environments you can possibly play in last weekend and really cross some things off. I kind of chuckled because you and I talked last weekend, and you asked me some of the keys to the game in terms of starting fast. And I said, you can't really have those, pre-snap penalties, those false starts. And I'll be danged if the first play from scrimmage, Alabama gets a false start out of the left tackle. I was like, oh, man, it's like a prophecy at this point.
Yes.
But look, I think that Oklahoma's going to give you their best shot. And their team, honestly, I think is getting better. Now, I think you are too, but it's not like Brent Venables somehow forgot to coach defense. And I think that's going to be the biggest litmus test in terms of what they bring to the table. So, look, the Iron Bowl is the Iron Bowl. It's its own animal. It always is. It fits along the lines of Texas, Oklahoma, the Egg Bowl, Michigan, Ohio State. You just never know what you're going to get. But going on the road, and Bama's played in some pretty hostile environments this year, I think that Bama proved a couple of things that they can build off of last week. And schematically, I love what I saw. I think Jalen Milroe is finally healthy, although they may never admit that he wasn't not healthy. I love what you're able to do against LSU last weekend. So I just think it's all about ironing out the kinks, getting back to the film room, looking at the details, and making sure you're focused on all the right things for the next few weeks.
Agree on all parts, no question. Mike, I feel like we saw a Jalen Milroe that we hadn't seen in a couple of weeks, whether that was because there was something in the background, whatever it was, and never really confirmed it. But I do feel like we're in a good place in terms of where Jalen Milroe is health-wise as they move forward, welcoming in Mercer, then at Oklahoma, and then, of course, the Iron Bowl at Bryant-Denny Stadium this year. Looking forward to the last three of the college football regular season as Alabama looks to clinch a spot in the 12-team playoff. For Mike Johnson, I'm Simone Eli. This has been Head to Head, and we will see you next week.
Brought to you by Alabama Beef Farmers and Ranchers.